For most of human history, India was one of the richest places on Earth, rivaling that of China or all of Europe. But after 200 years of British colonization, India was left as one of the poorest regions in the world. So in this video, we explain how that happened. Chapter 0. The spice must flow. To understand the colonization of India, we first need to understand what led Europeans to travel there in the first place. You see, we Europeans have a problem. Our food. European food used to be incredibly bland. Because Europe doesn't have very good spices. While we have rosemary, parsley and dill, they are nothing compared to pepper, cinnamon or ginger. There is a reason why there are Vietnamese, Indonesian and Chinese restaurants all over the world, but there are very few European restaurants. Asia simply has better spices. And food from Europe that is good almost always requires ingredients from Asia, Africa or the Americas. So, for thousands of years, Europeans have been buying spices from Asia. The oldest East Asian spices found in Europe date to 12,000 years ago. The oldest civilization is about 6,000 years old. That means the spice trade is older than civilization itself. And the reason spices could be traded even back then is because they are essentially toxic. They are meant to kill small animals who want to eat them. But because humans are so big, it barely affects us. But because it is still slightly toxic, it means that spices can take years to spoil, therefore making the spice trade possible even in the Stone Age. But how did that trade work exactly? Well, first the spices are harvested. Then they are taken to a nearby town where a trader will buy a large amount of them. This trader then goes to the next town and sells the spices for a profit. However, a single town didn't need to have 10 bags of black pepper or 10 bags of nutmeg. So what would happen is that the local people bought the spices they needed for themselves and then the rest was sold off to another trader. That other trader then takes the remaining spices to yet another town. This process would continue over and over again, starting somewhere in Southeast Asia and then slowly being transported all over Europe, Asia and parts of Africa. But because there are mountains and deserts between East Asia and Western Europe, there are only two main routes a person could use. To see the exact route, let's look at this map of the world. The first route was here, through China to Central Asia and finally to Europe. This trade route would eventually be called the Silk Road. The second trade route was via India, through the Middle East and then to Europe. As a result, India and China each controlled one of the two major trade routes in the world. And in the case of India, they had several large rivers providing plenty of water for agriculture. The Indus River, the Ganges River or the Brahmaputra River are some of the most fertile regions in the world. And for thousands of years, these rivers were used to trade spices. Eventually, civilizations grew along the trade routes and rivers. And they eventually grew to become one of the wealthiest regions in the world for most of Indian history. And just to be clear, at this time the concept of India did not yet exist, and for most of history, India was roughly this region of the world, which we today call the Indian subcontinent. In the modern world, this region contains the countries of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And while the focus of this video is India, we'll also mention the other countries when relevant. Anyway, India was the largest spice market in the world. Eventually, people learned how to build ships that could travel the sea. These trade ships remained close to the coastline, and as a result, those early traders created a new trade route along the coast, going from Southeast Asia, along the coast of India, around the Arabian Peninsula, and all the way to Egypt, meaning India controlled two of the three major trade routes to Europe. And over the course of millennia, the sea route became more important and ships learned to take shortcuts by traveling the seas and oceans. And empires continuously tried controlling these trade routes, not just in India, but also in Europe and the Middle East. And in the 15th century, there was a country that controlled almost all the spice routes, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were Turks who were brought to modern-day Turkey by the Mongol Empire, and the Ottomans had learned from the Mongols on how to rule an empire efficiently and how to conquer your enemies. The Ottomans conquered so many enemies that their empire eventually looked like this. As a result, they controlled both trade routes from India to Europe. And because the Ottomans didn't have any competition in the spice trade, they increased taxes on spices. Taxes eventually became so high that the spice trade to Europe slowed down. This caused a shortage of spices, which meant that the prices would go up even more. Chapter 1. First Contact. Rule of Acquisition number 10. Greed is eternal. The farther away from India you were, the more expensive spices became. One of the farthest places from India is Portugal, and in Portugal they found a substitute for spices: sugar, because sugar will make almost anything taste good. And in southern Portugal they grew sugarcane. But as the population increased, so too did the demand for sugar. But in order to grow enough, you need hot, wet climates, and only the very southern part of Portugal and Spain had a climate suitable for growing sugar. However, that land was not enough. And so Portugal decided to colonize the Azores in the Atlantic Ocean and the island of Madeira. Madeira especially was wet, hot and fertile, and they were very far away from Portugal. And remember before when I said that ships like to stay close to the coastline? The reason for that is that if there ever is a problem, such as there is no wind or the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, then you can just go ashore to get food. But if you're in the middle of the open ocean, there is no backup plan. You will eventually run out of food and water. And so Portuguese shipwrights developed a new type of ship, the caravel. This ship has a triangular mast which can be used to sail against the wind, allowing ships to reliably trade with the Portuguese sugar colonies or to just trade faster in general. But with those caravel ships, they were also able to travel a lot farther than just the Azores or just Madeira. In theory, these ships were capable of traveling almost anywhere in the world, as long as they had enough food on board. And because they could now travel anywhere in the world, they saw a new opportunity: sail south to Africa. You see, the coast along the Sahara Desert doesn't have fertile land. The desert transitions directly into a beach, meaning there is nobody to buy food from. At the same time, the winds push ships northward. This means that if you try to sail from Europe to Africa, you will be pushed back to Europe. However, the caravel could sail against the wind, meaning it was now finally possible to travel south and explore the coast of Africa. And with the prices of spices so high, some of those Europeans began wondering if they could perhaps sail around Africa towards India. At the time, they knew almost nothing of Africa south of the Sahara. So the Portuguese monarchy sent traders on special missions to explore the coastline. Each time, they would explore just a little further and set up a small trading fort to trade with the local African merchants. Until, after about a century, the first ship was able to make its way around Africa and eventually arrived in Calicut. There, they met with the local ruler, and this meeting went horribly. The Portuguese were considered rude. They did not understand that Hinduism was different from Christianity, and they failed to negotiate a trade treaty. However, they took a few Indians with them, so that the Portuguese might learn from their mistakes and try a second time. The trade missions that followed were a lot better prepared, and eventually Indian rulers began allowing Portuguese ships to trade in Indian ports. The spice trade that had been destroyed by the Ottoman Empire's taxes was suddenly flaring up again. The first ships that came back earned massive profits. As a result, more trade missions were funded. Ships became larger, journeys more frequent, and fleets more numerous. Eventually, other European powers also wanted to buy spices. The French, Dutch, British, and several others all sent trade missions to India or Southeast Asia, and India rebuilt their ports and trade networks to welcome them all. Just as the Portuguese had done in Africa, all those European empires rented a plot of land to set up their own trade colony in India. They would both buy spices and resupply ships going to Southeast Asia, thereby creating networks of small forts and trading colonies all the way from Europe to the coast of Africa, to India, and finally to Southeast Asia, just to gain access to that delicious spice. However, over time Europeans also became interested in other things, such as Indian textile or indigo, which you can use to dye your clothes with. By the year 1600, the British finally arrived in India. and they did so under the banner of the East India Company. It's called the East India Company because they referred to the Americas as the West Indies. And the reason it was a company and not a country who colonized India is because at first the British only wanted to make money. The goal was not to rule over India, the goal was to trade with India. And so the government gave the company a monopoly on all trade with India and various surrounding regions. Meaning that if you were British and wanted to trade with India, you needed to be a licensed trader with the East India Company. And the reason the British used the monopoly instead of letting multiple companies compete was because collecting taxes on multiple companies was difficult. By buying the monopoly, the East India Company was essentially just paying a tax to the government. Anyone who traded without the company's permission was arrested and the cargo confiscated. But the English government didn't have a police force in India yet, so they decided the company would handle all the arrests, which was easier for them because they knew exactly who worked for them and who did not. With the monopoly in hand, the East India Company started setting up trade colonies all over India. Focus your attention on this map. By 1750, the British had trade colonies in all of these places. And if you look closely, you will see a small French colony here and a few Portuguese colonies there. However, trade between India and Europe had become largely a British trade. Chapter 2. The Fall of the Mughal. While the Europeans were trading in India, the Mughal Empire was conquering in India, and the empire had grown to become a superpower of its time. It stretched from modern-day Bangladesh all the way to Afghanistan, eventually taking over most of India and about 25% of the world's economy. The Mughal Empire was so powerful that no European country even stood a chance to conquer India. So then, how did the British colonize India? Well, the Mughal Empire conquered India quickly, too quickly. Instead of consolidating the empire, its leaders just kept expanding. But wars cost money, and the larger your territory, the longer it takes for your troops to arrive at the battle. The more supplies you will need to use, and the more costly each war becomes. Eventually, fighting wars costs more money than you can take from the land that you conquer. As more money is spent on the military, the less is spent on the people, and those people will start to hate their government. And as the empire expanded, it had even more people to potentially hate them. And also, the way the Mughal Empire conquered new territory made rebellion easy. They would force a defeated leader to work for the emperor at his court. One such fallen leader managed to escape, created a rebellion, and formed the Maratha Confederacy. While the Mughal emperors were Muslims, they repressed Hindus, and the Confederacy was Hindu. As a result, a lot of Hindu people joined the rebellion. As the empire started losing territories to its rebellions, it was also attacked by rival empires. With each region lost, the less money they had for their army and the easier it was to attack them again in the future. Eventually, the country suffered through multiple civil wars until it was sacked by the Persian Empire and conquered by the Maratha Confederacy. And while the Mughal Empire was falling apart, the UK saw opportunity. In the year 1756, Britain and France went to war with each other. There are many names for this war. In the US, it's called the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. And in India, it's called the Third Carnatic War. And in that war, the British East India Company suddenly found itself in conflict with the French East India Company. The British had more money, stronger ships, and better cannons. And as a result, the British East India Company won that fight. However, the company wasn't originally meant to go to war, it was meant to earn money for the shareholders back in the UK. So they wanted to make money off of this military victory. And nobody has more money in an economy than the government. That's because the government has a police and army with which to take taxes. And one of the fastest ways to get rich is to get some of those taxes. The East India Company knew this, and they decided to take a risk. They signed a peace treaty with France and its Indian allies, in which the employees of the company will become tax collectors for the regions of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. However, as rule of acquisition number 8 states, small print leads to big risk. Because from now on, it wasn't the government collecting its own taxes, it was a foreign company collecting the taxes for them. And this gave that company immense power. You see, when you control taxes, you control the entire government. Because if a government wants to do something, they need money. So the state now had to ask the East India Company for money, and the company could just decide not to hand it over. Over time, the British began taking more and more taxes for themselves and shipping it off to the UK. And the only way for Indian rulers to slow down this process was to give the company something other than money, meaning that the Indian leaders in these regions gave up more and more political power to the British just so they could hold on to some of their taxes. Until eventually, over many decades, there was nothing left for the British to take anymore, and the British simply took over. A portion of the Indian taxes that the company received was spent on creating a British Indian army with troops from the regions that the company now controlled. And because the UK had some of the best guns, cannons and warships, it meant that this army could prevent anyone from starting a rebellion effectively. However, most of the taxes that the company took from the lands it conquered were sent straight to London and its shareholders. And this in turn was all done with the backing of the British government, because many high-ranking officials were also shareholders of the East India Company, meaning that the shareholders were passing legislation that would make the East India Company more money so that they themselves could earn more money. Over time, the East India Company copied this strategy that they used in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa all over India. They created something called the Doctrine of Lapse, meaning that whenever there was a lapse in leadership, the British would then come in and offer their support to one side in the civil war. And in exchange for British support, once the war was over, the company got to install their own employees as tax collectors. Over time, the British grew more powerful. They grew so powerful that various Indian rulers decided to just join the British willingly. Those Indian rulers would in turn get to keep being in charge of their territory, but they would have to pay taxes to the East India Company. And usually, those taxes were so high that the ruler couldn't invest in economic development or an army strong enough to defeat the British. To show you how this was done, let's have a look at the example of the princely state called Hyderabad. At the end of the 18th century, Hyderabad was forced to sign a treaty with the British in which it became a princely state under the East India Company. Hyderabad was then forced to pay the salaries for all the British officials sent to his territory. And those officials decided to give themselves very high salaries, of course, which Hyderabad had to pay. To give an example, a military commander might receive £5,000 per month, which is about 3.8 million US dollars per year in today's money. In order to pay for all of these loans, Hyderabad would have to take out a loan. And as part of their treaty with the British, they were only allowed to borrow from the East India Company. And the company, of course, decided to set a very high interest rate of 24%. As the British demanded more money, Hyderabad was forced to borrow even more from the British in order to repay the British. Eventually, they borrowed so much that they would never be able to repay it, and the more in debt they became, the more they were forced to do as the company commanded. Chapter 3. Subjugating India. In order to collect all those taxes, the East India Company needed employees to actually take them. But the more employees you hire, the more salaries you have to pay, and the less money you can give to your shareholders. As a result, the East India Company only ever had a couple of thousand employees stationed in India at any one time, with about 300,000 soldiers under their command, most of whom were from India themselves. There were so few company officials that if one of them turned out to be corrupt and decided to take some of those taxes they were collecting for themselves, then there wasn't anyone to report him. So to make sure the company still got their income, they created a very strict set of rules for tax collection. For example, farmers had to start paying taxes for the land they worked on. The East India Company then counted how many farms there were, how many taxes they would have to pay, and then give one of their employees the task of collecting it. If they didn't get as much as the company predicted, they might get fired or demoted. As a result, anyone who actually cared about long-term development or helping the Indian population would have to divert time away from collecting taxes. If they did that, they were fired and replaced with people who did not care. People who were only focused on taking money from India, until eventually nobody in the company cared about anything else except taking money. The tax farmers had to pay was different per region, but usually it was just low enough that an Indian person could survive, but not so high that they could make much of a profit. As a result, this strict tax policy meant that Indians didn't have food or money saved for a bad year. So if the crops fail for just one season, then the Indian farmer couldn't pay their taxes. This was different under Indian rulers, because Indian rulers only demanded a percentage of the harvest. And if a farmer didn't grow enough food, they didn't have to pay taxes. And instead, they were given food from previous harvests so they wouldn't starve. But now, under the East India Company rule, a single bad harvest meant you still had to pay taxes, and if you couldn't pay taxes, you were evicted from your land, meaning you were now homeless. To make things even more difficult for farmers, the British demanded that all taxes were paid in cash. However, up until that point, farmers were allowed to pay their taxes with whatever food they were growing. Within small communities, resources were often shared, and as a result, money was only really necessary for trade with the outside world. But back when cars and public transport did not exist, most people almost never left the community they were born in. To give a personal example, the first time my grandmother was in another country was when the Netherlands was annexed by Germany. As a result, the average farmer did not have cash on them. So now, all over the East India Company's territory, farmers begin selling their food to earn cash. But if everybody is selling food at the same time, then the price of that food goes down. And keep in mind that most of India consisted of farmers. So, as a farmer, who are you going to sell food to? Other farmers already have their own food. So even if you have a good harvest, you still wouldn't be able to earn enough cash to pay your tax. Now, normally this isn't too big of a problem, because if a government, for example, takes $1 billion in taxes, then they will also spend $1 billion in taxes. So then money goes from a farmer to, for example, a teacher, who then in turn buys food from that farmer. This is how most economies work today. However, the East India Company's taxes were profit, and that profit was paid out to shareholders in London. In fact, about 2/3 of the British Indian budget was paid out to its shareholders, and the other 1/3 was spent purely on the occupation of India, such as soldiers. On average, the British took about 8% of the total GDP per year, meaning that so much wealth was taken from India and shipped to the UK that India could no longer grow economically. And what this means is that because so much money was sent to the UK, there wasn't a lot of money in India anymore. But Indian farmers still had to find some way of getting cash to pay their taxes. And so they began growing things other than food, such as indigo, which they could then sell to the British. As a result, the company created a system where farmers grew indigo or some other crop, then sold it to the company in exchange for cash, and then those farmers paid their taxes to the company with the money they just received from the company. This was just a gigantic scheme to force Indians to grow valuable crops for the British so they could earn even more money. And in fact, the British used a lot of tricks like this to take over India. For example, people who still couldn't pay their taxes, even with indigo, were removed from their land. That land was then given to wealthy British people who became landlords. And then those very same Indians who had just been evicted from their land were then rehired by the landlord to grow crops. This was just a giant scheme to take more from India. In the late 18th century, there was something even more valuable than indigo: opium. At the time, China did not want to buy anything. They only wanted to sell things in exchange for silver. However, silver was a currency. As a result, as the British sent more silver to China, they literally ran out of money. But eventually they found something the Chinese people did want to buy: opium. And India is right next to China. And so all over modern-day Northeast India and Bangladesh, the British created opium plantations, turning this part of India and the company into the largest drug empire the world has ever seen. And the more land was spent on growing indigo, opium, sugar and other crops, the less land was used for growing food. Normally this isn't a problem. You can just create more farmland in India using irrigation canals. However, because so much money was going to the UK, there wasn't any money for that, and as a result, there was not enough food. Over the course of 2 centuries, millions of people died in India from famine. I can't list all the famines here, we'd be here all day, but they are scrolling on screen right now. It is thought that over 35 million people starved in India between 1793 and 1900, with millions more in the 20th century. In India, one of the most fertile regions in the entire world. And the more the crops failed, the more Indians had their land taken away, and the more powerful the British became. As the British forced the Indian people to grow more crops for them, those British decided to turn more of India's working population into farmers. You see, India was such a wealthy country not just because it could grow a lot of food, it was also wealthy because it had industry. Textile, steel and ship construction were some of the most important industry of any economy in the 18th and 19th centuries. And India had all three. In fact, India's industry was one of the most advanced in the world at the time. And the British decided they wanted that industry for themselves. They wanted a system where India and other British colonies would produce raw materials like cotton, sugarcane, indigo or gold. Those resources would then be transported to the UK, and there British factories turned them into manufactured goods, which it sold to the colonies again. The profits on goods were a lot higher than on raw materials, thereby making the British wealthier and keeping its colonies poor and submissive. And the first place they started was the Indian textile industry. Because while the Indians were being colonized, the USA declared independence. The USA was Britain's main cotton provider, but now that they were independent, the UK looked for another colony to produce cotton. And that place was India. In fact, the best and cheapest textiles already came from India, made with Indian cotton. And remember, the East India Company's main goal was to make money, and they were installing tax collectors all over India. Through them, the company began putting a 70 to 80% tax on all textiles made in India, thereby putting the tax in textile. This tax was so incredibly high that Indian cloth was more expensive than British cloth. While at first the company earned a lot of money off of this, over time those Indians simply began buying British textile instead of Indian textile, and without customers, those Indian manufacturers were forced to shut down one by one, until eventually all of them went bankrupt. India did not get more textiles or better textiles because of this, they just got British textiles instead of Indian textiles. But why did the East India Company destroy such a valuable source of taxation for short-term gains? Well, first of all, they were able to sell the knowledge of Indian manufacturing to the British. Those British engineers then constructed their own factories based on Indian designs back in the UK. And secondly, the East India Company had a monopoly on trade with India, meaning that they could earn more money shipping cotton to the UK and British textiles to India than they could by simply taxing Indian-made textiles. It was simply more profitable for them to transport goods multiple times back and forth. This strategy was then repeated over and over again with other Indian industries. The next target was the steel industry. India produced some of the best steel in the world, so they put a tax on it and then sold the manufacturing knowledge to British steelmakers. Next, they went after ships, creating laws that only the British were allowed to build ocean-going ships, thereby destroying most of India's shipyards and instead creating a gigantic shipbuilding industry in the UK. And so, over time, India was deindustrialized, meaning that it lost most of its industry, and instead they focused on growing crops and mining resources to sell to the British at a low price. And in turn, they began buying manufactured goods from the British at a high price. The East India Company took the Indus out of industry. To make sure no new Indian industries could ever threaten the British, they only allowed Indians to invest in small businesses. So while they owned something like a newspaper, they would not be allowed to invest in something as important as a coal mine, for example. Eventually, Indians were fully subjugated by the company. They were forced to grow certain crops for the British, to hand over their profits to the British, to only trade with the British, and to only buy British, until everything revolved around the British. And that was incredibly profitable for factory owners in the UK, because you could always buy raw materials at a low price from India, and you always had hundreds of millions of Indians who could only buy your products. Overall, Indians could buy more products than the British could produce, and so the UK started to innovate. The British innovated so much that they created factories with steam-powered machines. Those steam-powered machines were used on a large scale to create textile, and that textile was then sold to Indians. And so, because the UK always had so many customers in India, it was the first country able to industrialize. The British Industrial Revolution relied on Indian poverty. And as a result, India went from a land where communities were self-sufficient, with democratic local governments, with a wealthy economy where taxes were spent on the development of the region, and it was transformed into a land of poor farmers forced to produce raw materials for British industrialization. And in the process, the shareholders of the East India Company became incredibly wealthy. To quote a British government official, "The fundamental principle of the English has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient in every possible way to the interests and benefits of themselves. They have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every successive province, as it has fallen unto our possession, has been made a field for higher extraction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above which the native rulers were able to extort." Chapter 4. The British Raj. This process of colonization was often resisted by the Indians themselves, and several wars and rebellions took place. One of the biggest rebellions, however, took place in 1857, when over 800,000 Indians armed themselves and fought the British. While the British did win, it became clear to many that the company would not be able to hold on to India forever. Therefore, it was decided that the British government would take over control of British India. They would then call this colony the British Raj. The British took over in 1858, and they largely left the company system in place. But instead of a governor assigned by shareholders, they now had a governor assigned by the British Queen, and its shareholders were replaced with members of parliament, many of whom were already shareholders anyway. On top of that, the British government would pay a certain amount of money each year to the East India Company for the right to rule India. And because many members of the British government were shareholders in the company, they were essentially making a deal with themselves to give more money to themselves. However, the biggest fear for the British was still another rebellion. India by the 1850s had around 200 million people. During the rebellion, less than 0.5% of Indians rebelled, and even that was a problem. If somehow millions of Indians started a rebellion, there might not be a lot that the British could do to stop them. That is because they only had around 6,000 administrators, 70,000 British troops, and another 230,000 Indian soldiers. In short, the British were severely outnumbered. Therefore, they started a strategy of divide and conquer. Using this strategy, Indians were divided into as many groups as possible and forced to compete against each other for land, power, and resources. For example, the British did not control all of India directly. They had princely states, and the princes who ruled the princely states were not all equal. Some of them were given special privileges. Some princes had control over other princes. Some princes paid less in tribute, and other princes were allowed to send their children to the UK to receive some of the best education in the world. However, the British would only allow a portion of princes to have these privileges. Those privileges could be taken away at any moment, and as a result, the Indian princes began competing to gain the British favor. This policy was duplicated in all sections of Indian society, such as religion. As the British took more land from Indian farmers, they turned them into plantations, and they hired those same farmers to work on the plantations. However, there were not enough jobs for everyone, so the British would allocate land to either Hindu or Muslim populations. So for example, only one group could be hired to work on a plantation, meaning that for one group to get a job and survive under the British system, they had to compete with the other group, causing them to fight amongst each other instead of the British. Or they might assign an entire region as either Hindu or Muslim, and then give special rights to just one religious group. A good example is the region of Bengal, which was split into two regions, and one was assigned to the Muslims and one to Hindus, causing eastern part of Bengal to become a Muslim majority region where Muslims held more rights. However, those Muslims were only barely in the majority, and as a result, the people began fighting against each other instead of the British. And policies like these were copied all over the country, pitting Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs against each other. In order to make those Muslims seem like even more of a threat, the British Indian military would be made up of 50% Muslim, while they were only 20% of the British population. As a result, there were many Hindu villages where the main encounter with Muslims was as a British soldier taking their taxes, and Muslims became a symbol of oppression among the Hindus, instead of the British. As a result of all of these policies, India ended up more divided than ever before. Small issues flared up into large issues, and even today, many of these divisions still exist within India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. India is big. India is really big, with over 200 million people. In order to implement all these policies, the British Raj needed some sort of system to oversee all of them. So they created an organization called the Indian Civil Service. This was a copy of the British Civil Service, and it comprises all the people who are not elected by the people or selected by the monarch. This includes mayors, tax collectors, office clerks, etc. And the East India Company employees now became government employees, working within the Indian Civil Service. The British Raj was just as obsessed with collecting money as the company had been. You see, most of the income from the British Raj went to the UK government, and that government was used to fund social services and economic development back in the UK. The more money they got from India, the more money they could spend on making British people happy. And the happier the people, the more votes that government will receive in the next election. As a result, the only thing the British actually cared about in India was how much money could a civil servant take from the Indian people. And so the performance evaluation of a civil servant only ever looked at how much taxes they could collect, meaning that doing anything other than collecting taxes meant you were less likely to get promoted, or you might even be fired. And this was true from the lowest to the highest rank. Even the governor himself had to spend most of his time focusing on collecting as much money for the UK as possible. As a result, there was no plan to prevent famines. There was no development. There was only wealth extraction. In order to not get the blame for the poverty and famine they caused in India, the civil service created an endless amount of excuses. The people were lazy, there were just too many people to feed, or they just weren't smart enough to operate in a European system, while at the same time ignoring the fact that the British made every one of India's problems much worse. So, in order to justify colonization to the British people, the government told them that colonization was actually improving the lives of the people in their colonies. And the British Raj decided to create a lot of fake work that seemed like they were very busy, while in reality not doing anything. For example, they would just create extra paperwork, forcing people to fill out the same form multiple times, and add as many useless steps in the process, creating a gigantic web of bureaucracy. It was usually so complex that average Indians would not be able to make use of it, even when it might actually be helpful. And the government used the argument that if so much paperwork was being produced, then surely something productive must be happening. And in a time where investigative journalism wasn't really a thing, it meant that it was very difficult to find out the truth. And anyone who did speak out was silenced by that British government. Let's look at one concrete example of how they exaggerated the work being done. There is an account of a 24-year-old district officer with no knowledge of the native people, didn't know anything about the land, and had no experience. However, he had dozens of jobs. I won't read them all out to you, but they are sliding on screen right now if you're interested. And the British Raj argued that someone with so many jobs must surely be productive, right? And while he did attend various meetings, the only actual work he ever did was collecting taxes and sending it back to London. While doing less work, the civil servants in India were actually paid more than the civil servants in the UK. India became a place where minor nobility or the middle class could earn a lot of money and make a career. Some British families lived and worked in India for generations. However, they never saw themselves as Indians. They might be born in India, but live in a British neighborhood, receive a British education, and upon retiring, go back to the UK. And those British people made up around 96% of the Indian civil service. In fact, there were more statues of Queen Victoria in India than there were Indians working in the Indian civil service, while at the same time, the British government systematically denied promotions to Indians within the military or their government. Indians were also paid less than a British person in the same position. Instead, Indian civil servants were placed under the command of less competent British people, and those Indians who were actually allowed into the British Indian government had been anglicized. What this meant is that they studied in Britain, lived a British lifestyle, and now considered themselves to be British. They usually came from the Indian elites who supported the colonization. In exchange for supporting the British, they would be allowed to send their children to British schools. And in time, they would become British. To quote the British Viceroy of India, "We are all British gentlemen engaged in the magnificent work of governing an inferior race." To give one concrete example of how Indian civil servants were treated, let's look at the example of an Indian man called Mr. Chetty. After receiving an English education at Rennes and Oxford, he passed the civil service examination with a very good grade, and so he was posted to a district in India. However, in order to engage with his fellow civil servants, he needed entry into the clubs. At these clubs, deals were made and professional relationships were created. However, they refused to accept Mr. Chetty as a member because he was Indian. And as a result, Mr. Chetty could never engage in Indian politics despite his qualifications. To quote the first Prime Minister of India, "The Indian civil service was neither Indian nor civil nor a service." When the British first arrived in India, they considered the Indians as their equals. They were trade partners and quite often romantic partners. Between 1600 and 1800, the British and Indians mingled together. There were strong trade relationships, friendships, and political marriages. Yet, at the end of the 18th century, this started to change. The more the British tried to conquer India, the more they try to extract wealth from India. And taking wealth is easiest when you have no guilty conscience. People who sympathize with the British would never be able to take as much taxes as a person who ruthlessly took it. As a result, people who had no compassion for Indians began to rule India. And in order to make those Indian people as easy to control as possible, the British began a campaign of cultural re-education, with the goal of destroying anything that might oppose the British and instead replace them with a system that would support the British. And while the UK was successfully dividing the Indian population and pitting them against each other, when you have over hundreds of millions of people, just one of those groups could already start a rebellion involving hundreds of thousands of people. And one rebellion might inspire more rebellions. So, in order to prevent that, the British tried enforcing a new cultural identity for India. For example, in order to destroy a millennia-year-old tradition of Indian governance, they simply made them illegal. The British replaced local government councils with British administrators. Often, those administrators were too busy to actually do the administrating, meaning that the local communities had no effective leadership. Until, after several generations, the knowledge of Indian leadership had disappeared. The British could also remove half the potential leaders by removing rights for women. They created a system whereby women were forced to rely on their husbands and sons. This was similar to policies in the UK at the time. Women weren't allowed to make large financial transactions without supervision of a man or even have their own bank account. Women in many areas were no longer allowed to own property, and instead their husbands would become the owner. And when the husband died, the wife and daughters did not receive an inheritance. If a woman was assaulted, the man would only be convicted if the woman could prove it wasn't her fault. It was simply assumed that all women were guilty of provoking an assault unless proven innocent. This forced women to have to fight for basic human rights all over again, creating a division in India between men who gained more power over women and women who wanted to be independent. The British could remove even more potential leaders by using the Indian caste system. This system assigned certain jobs and rights to people based on which caste their parents belonged to. The British enforced this system in order to make it even more difficult for a person to move from one position in the caste system to another, meaning that if you were not born in the caste of rulers, you would never be able to become one either. As a result, most Indian people were now prevented from becoming leaders. This left only a very small group of Indians who could potentially resist the British occupation. So to make sure they did not rebel, the British destroyed Indian schools and universities. If an Indian wanted an education, they would have to go to Great Britain. However, in order to go to the UK, you first needed permission from the British, and they would simply just not allow a lot of Indians to study there. And in the end, without effective leadership, it was much harder to resist the British. Communities that had built up wealth for centuries, had lived through multiple rises and falls of empires, were now destroyed by the British. And in less than 200 years, India was stripped of its wealth. The British had created an India that was divided along religion, along caste, gender, location, nobility, and much more. While the British, meanwhile, held all the power. They were the best educated, the wealthiest. They ruled the army, the police, the government. They controlled trade, controlled taxes. They controlled everything. The British had molded the Indian social structure in such a way that the British were now at the top of the Indian hierarchy. Chapter 5: The Indian National Congress. While the British ruled India, there were several rebellions. All of them failed to liberate the region. Great Britain was the world's superpower in the 19th century, and by now the Indians had no leadership and no unity upon which to base a successful rebellion. And so a group of Indian elites began to formulate a new plan to get more political and economic power. They would create an organization set up by Indian lawyers, Indian civil service members, and British people who were sympathetic with the Indians in order to advocate for the rights of Indians. And so they founded an organization in 1885 called the Indian National Congress. And they are still in the Indian government to this day. Their goal at first was not to declare independence from the British Empire, but rather to simply have more power for Indian people in the British Indian government. For 22 years, they published newspapers expressing their ideas. By 1875, India already had 475 newspapers owned and written by Indians themselves. So when the Congress was created, they also created their own newspapers, which advocated for Indian nationalism, which exposed the corruption of the British Indian government, and which fostered a sense of unity among all British Indian citizens. They then used that support to appeal to the British government for the creation of a more democratic system which also included the Indians. They pushed to pass legislation that would protect the rights of Indian people, and they sent representatives to the British Indian government to directly communicate with the governor. However, their demands to put Indians in the government were ignored. Their legislations were ignored, and their representatives to the Indian government were ignored. The British simply did not care. In very simple terms, their performance was evaluated based on how much money they could send to England, not on the satisfaction of the people they were ruling over. There was simply no need to ever listen to the Indians as long as those Indians continued to cooperate with the British anyway. Instead, the British saw the Indian Congress as a nuisance and a source of potential rebellion. And so they began preventing them from publishing their ideas. While the British Empire officially practiced free speech, in India that only meant speech the government approved of, creating a strange situation where the British were both advocating for free speech while also punishing people who practiced it. Newspapers and printing presses were often shut down by the government, and the editors prosecuted and sentenced to hard labor. This went on for over 2 decades. By the early 1900s, there were people in their 20s who had watched the Indian National Congress achieve nothing for their entire lifetime. So now it was clear that not only was rebellion useless, talking to the British was also useless. As a result, people who were frustrated due to their lack of success over the last 20 years began looking for a new way to get the attention of the British. They came to a very logical conclusion. If all the British care about is their money, then we should make it as difficult as possible for the British to earn money in India. And so members of the Indian Congress began standing outside of British shops and asking people to stop buying from the British. And they would direct them to an Indian shop instead. Technically, asking people to go to a different shop wasn't illegal. And it worked. British business owners began losing money, and the British didn't really know how to deal with this. The British were used to violence resistance, guerrilla wars, and mass revolts. Not just people standing around politely asking other people to shop elsewhere. For the first time, the Indians were actually getting the attention of the British. In 1915, a man called Mohandas K. Gandhi, or simply called Gandhi, arrived in India. He was an Indian lawyer who studied at University College London. He advocated for the rights of Indians living in South Africa and was now coming home to India. In South Africa, Gandhi had used non-violence resistance against the British. As such, they refused to abide by segregation laws and refused to cooperate with the British until the demands for more rights were met. And he succeeded. This made him somewhat of a hero among the Indian people back in India, a man who stood up to the British and won. And Gandhi quickly joined the Indian National Congress to support the cause of Indian self-rule, meaning that India would remain part of the British Empire and under British oversight. However, its internal affairs would largely be managed by Indians themselves, and Gandhi concluded that the Congress should seek the support of regular Indians. Up until now, the Congress was mostly headed by Indian elites, who made speeches and news articles for each other. To give an example, only about 10% of Indians could read and write, meaning their newspapers could only reach a small percentage of the population. Meanwhile, the hundreds of millions of Indians were largely unaffected. Those who had been driven from their lands, watched friends and family die of starvation, who had experienced the worst the British had to offer. And so they began to seek support from Indians of all classes, of all castes, from all over India. Members of the Indian Congress began communicating with the other castes and classes. They began sharing their ideas with methods other than newspapers, such as holding speeches for the masses, for example. And they began sending news articles to England in the hopes that British newspapers would expose the British atrocities in India, so that no British person could claim ignorance of the crimes of their government, and hopefully create a movement in the UK that supported Indian Home Rule. And this new approach resonated with a lot of Indians. That's because between 1914 and 1918, the British Empire was involved in World War I, and over 1 million Indians would serve in the British Army all over the world to fight the Germans, Ottomans, and Austrians. However, in exchange, the British promised Indian Home Rule within the British Empire. What this meant is that India would govern its own affairs, similar to Australia, Canada, or New Zealand. However, this was a lie. The British had absolutely no intention of granting Indians self-government. They just didn't want to deal with an Indian revolution alongside a world war. And so they told the Indians whatever they thought they wanted to hear, just to keep them quiet until the war was over. However, to Congress, waiting for the war to be over wasn't fast enough, and so the Indians organized giant protests of millions of people. They began to refuse to work together with the British, and they would openly disobey unjust laws. The reasoning was that a few 100,000 soldiers could not imprison millions and millions of Indians. The cost would be so great that India would no longer earn the British any money anymore. And that was the goal: make India so expensive to operate that the British would simply walk out. However, eventually the war was over, and the process of handing over power to the Indians should begin. Except, of course, the British delayed. They delayed so long, the Indians realized that the promise of home rule was a lie. This caused a great deal of resentment among the British Indian population. Over 1 million soldiers fought in the war. 84,000 of them didn't come home, and another 64,000 came home wounded. And during the war, India suffered a famine, killing millions. And after 4 years in a British war, they were rewarded with absolutely nothing. And so, by 1919, the people began to riot and protest all over India. Chapter 6: The Shadow of Amritsar. On April 9th, 1919, the British government arrested two nationalist leaders in a city called Amritsar. When the people living there heard about it, they flocked to the streets in protests. Those protests escalated into a riot and 15 people died. To establish order, the city called in the British Army, which sent a man called General Reginald Dyer along with some troops. They arrived 2 days later, on April 11th. By then, the violence had already died down. However, General Dyer forbade gatherings in groups of more than 3 people and any kind of protest in the city of Amritsar. 2 days later, on April 13th, 10 to 15,000 people went to Amritsar to celebrate a spring festival called Baisakhi Festival. They were not from the city and did not know about General Dyer's proclamation. However, when the general found out that people were gathering in the city, he marched his troops to the festival. He did not try to find out why those people were there. He did not try to warn them of the proclamation. He did not try to arrest them. He ordered his soldiers to shoot into the crowds. 1,650 rounds of ammo were used. We don't know how many died, but estimates go as high as 1,500. Random civilians celebrating a religious spring festival were killed without even knowing why. This event is known as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. For his actions, General Dyer was forced to resign to England. A conservative newspaper took pity on him and launched a donation campaign. When converted into today's money, it's worth around $1.6 million that he received. The families of those who died received roughly $1,800 each in today's money. This event was a rallying cry for the people of British India. Many of them began to openly question British rule. New protest movements were formed, and the Indian National Congress gained more supporters than ever before. Indians working in the Indian civil service began to question their bosses openly and joined the Congress. And at the same time, it became clear the British weren't going to give home rule to India as promised. As a result, the Congress stopped asking for home rule and started demanding full independence. In the wake of this incident, the Indian people began to move. In 1920, the Indian National Congress started the non-cooperation movement. In simple terms, the people of British India were simply going to stop cooperating. When the British ordered them to work, they just wouldn't. If the British arrested them, they wouldn't cooperate. And if the British made a law the people disagreed with, then they'd break them on purpose. After all, a few 100,000 soldiers and police officers couldn't arrest millions and millions of Indians if those Indians refused to cooperate. Basically, they were going to be as annoying as possible. A lot of these tactics were so successful, they made it into a CIA manual called The Art of Simple Sabotage. For example, if a British oppressor asked them a question, they would lie. If they asked them for directions, they would tell them to go in the opposite direction of where they wanted to go. And if they were forced to work, they would take as long as possible, add as many steps in the process as possible, and insist small irrelevant things are done perfectly to waste as much of their time as possible. You know that one person in a group project who doesn't do anything? Basically, be that person. Now, just to be clear, I do not condone anyone using these tactics. If you're living in occupied territory right now, do not look up The Art of Simple Sabotage on CIA.com. Over the course of 2 years, large portions of the British Indian population simply refused to cooperate. In response, the British arrested almost all the members of the Indian National Congress, except for Gandhi, hoping that without leadership and organization, the entire uprising would fall apart. However, that's usually not how popular protests work, and so they just kept going. And the British didn't know how to deal with this. You see, up until now, revolutions in the colonies were rather small. With the exceptions of the US War of Independence, the British had never faced anything like this. And sure, there were large revolutions before, such as the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, but they were done by Europeans. And the British Indian government believed that only European people were smart enough to do something like that. So if they just arrested all the Indians with a British education, then they believed the revolution would just stop. After all, what were the people going to do? Keep protesting without their leaders? Anyway, then the people of British India just kept protesting even without their leaders. However, in one of the biggest plot twists in history, the revolution ended suddenly. There was an incident in Chauri Chara. In it, a police station was burned down and several people died inside. Appalled by the violence, Gandhi felt he had acted too swiftly in encouraging independence, while not emphasizing the importance of non-violence enough. And he decided the Indian people were not ready for independence and needed more preparations. At the time, the other leaders of the Indian National Congress were imprisoned by the British, leaving Gandhi as the de facto leader of the movement. And he called off the revolution. And so in 1922, Gandhi stopped the Indian Revolution and focused on building an India which he deemed was ready for independence. With independence no longer considered possible for the moment, the Indian National Congress began moving towards the idea of becoming a dominion again. While the British did not grant dominionship after World War I, as promised, they hoped that this time, by showing the damage Indian non-cooperation could do, that the British would be forced to give in. And if they didn't, Indians would protest once more. And this was a very, very slow battle. At first, the British once again lied about giving dominionship to the Indians, but had no interest in granting them any sort of real power within the empire. And so the Indians, as promised, began protesting some more. There were many instances of mass protests. However, one of the most famous ones is the Salt March. You see, in British India, the British controlled the production and sale of salt. Without salt, a person will die. So by being the one in control of the salt, they were able to earn a lot of money while also being able to essentially starve the population by taking away just one vital nutrient. However, salt is really easy to make. You could watch a YouTube video, go to the ocean and make some of your own salt right now. Gandhi began marching through India, starting from March 12 to April 6 in 1930, walking about 390 kilometers or about 240 miles. Quite a feat for a 60-year-old man. Along the way, more and more Indians joined him. Once at the coast, he made salt and continued further along the coast, going from town to town, city to city, just making salt, and spurring other people on to do it as well. Soon, there were hundreds of thousands of people across the Indian beaches buying and selling salt. And once again, a few thousand Englishmen could not control millions of Indians if those Indians refused to cooperate, thereby breaking yet another stronghold of the British. Protests such as these eventually led the British to give some self-governance just to end these expensive protests. And so, in 1935, the British granted home rule to about 10% of the British Indian population. However, the British had a plan. They were going to hold an election and split those elections between Hindus and Muslims. Each religion group could only vote for members of their own religious group, hoping that this would prevent cooperation between the two. Then the British openly favored the Muslim party, called the Muslim League. The goal was to make the Hindu population think that they were being discriminated against while being in the majority. This British policy was fiercely resisted both by the Muslims and the Hindus, and they eventually got the British to allow people to vote for any representative they wanted. But the British did manage to divide the Hindu and Muslim population even further. People on both sides began seeing each other with suspicion, as they were constantly on opposite sides of Indian politics, simply because they were the only two Indian parties with any real power. And there came the notion that declaring independence together might be a bad idea. Maybe they should be two countries instead of just one, Pakistan for the Muslims and India for the Hindus. Muslims began to question whether they wanted to become a minority in an independent India or a majority in an independent Pakistan. In 1937, these fears were realized during an election when the Indian National Congress got 617 out of 739 general seats it contested, and 25 of the 59 seats reserved exclusively for Muslims. with roughly 15.5 million voters out of a population of over 300 million. And while they had an election, most of the real power was still held by the British Indian government. And that British Indian government feared the popularity of the Indian National Congress and were told by London to undermine the organization at every opportunity, and most importantly, undermine the Indian independence movement. However, this order became a bit difficult to execute, because in 1939, just 2 years later, the British Empire joined World War II, and it wasn't going very well for them. As part of the empire, British India also joined the war. The elected Indian leaders were not consulted on this decision. Technically, they could remain out of the war. However, the native Indian leadership was actually willing to join the war. They viewed whatever Germany was doing at the time as a lot worse than what the British were doing, and were therefore willing to fight in the defense of the UK. However, in return, they wanted just one thing: home rule. But the British were still not willing to accept this. And so the Indian Congress began a movement called Quit India movement. Their demand was very simple: either give us home rule or take us out of the war, stating that if India does go to war, that it should be an Indian who makes that decision. People began protesting across India, but this time, with the war looming over them, the British squashed protests, shut down Indian newspapers, and imprisoned the entire Indian National Congress leadership. And over time, the Quit India movement died down, and it didn't achieve a lot. However, this gave the British an opportunity to once again create division in India and undermine the Indian National Congress even further. You see, the Congress leaders were arrested, and they were a largely Hindu organization. The Muslim organization, called the Muslim League, didn't get arrested. And so the British decided to give the Muslim League more power over Hindus, creating a sense among Hindus that they were under threat from Muslims. The British decided to strengthen the Muslim League by letting them gain more power, giving them government positions, and were allowed to hold speeches. The goal was to once again create division between Hindus and Muslims, hoping that if the Muslims were in charge of the independence movement, that the Hindus would turn against the Muslims and therefore wouldn't have enough support for independence. And because they were given these political freedoms, the League grew from 112,000 members in 1941 to over 2 million by 1944. And the British were hoping that those 2 million Muslims would start causing a lot of problems with the Hindus. That's because the British government largely held the opinion that the native population was barbarous and incapable of being civilized without British oversight. However, they were wrong. Instead, the Muslim League began advocating for an independent Pakistan instead of trying to fight with Hindus. While this did cause some resentment among non-Muslims, it wasn't so bad that it distracted the rest of the country from independence. Chapter 7: Independence at Last. World War II was over, and the leaders of the Indian Congress were released. The British wanted to discredit the Congress as much as possible, so they announced elections just months later. The Congress leadership was still reorganizing, while the Muslim League had only gained in influence. As a result, Congress found it very difficult to get Muslims to vote for them, and as a result, the election was largely split along religious lines, exactly like the British had hoped. Most Muslims voted for the Muslim League, and most Hindus voted for the Indian National Congress. The League gained so many voters among Muslims that its leader, a man called Muhammad Ali Jinnah, proclaimed that he spoke for a majority of Muslims in British India, and that those Muslims wanted an independent Pakistan. Congress, on the other hand, still wanted them to declare independence together as a single united Indian nation. This caused a lot of friction between the Muslim and Hindu populations, because in a united India, Muslims would become a minority. They were afraid that the oppression of the British would simply be replaced with the oppression of the Hindu. There were mutinies in the army, afraid that one religious group would dominate another. There were clashes between Hindus and Muslims during independence rallies, and even police officers openly took sides. This left only the British to be able to maintain the peace, exactly what they were hoping for. However, as civil unrest grew, new countries tried to gain influence in India as well. China, Afghanistan, the USSR, and the USA were each looking towards India as a potential future ally. At the same time, the British were still recovering from World War II and could not hold off all four of them at once. And for all they knew, they might have to deal with a Soviet-backed communist revolution in India. And so the British came up with a completely new strategy to control India: leave. The British believed that the native population couldn't rule itself. The British would then decide to go away and maybe leave a few troops behind. Then, once India became independent, they would surely collapse into a civil war. The British could then come back, re-establish order, and present itself as the best form of government India could possibly hope for. And so, in February of 1946, the British government finally decided to sit down with the Indians to hand over power at some point in the future. These negotiations were incredibly difficult. The British at this point just wanted to get out of India. At this point, they were essentially too much trouble. But the Muslim League and Indian Congress couldn't agree on how to become independent. To discuss these issues, a government was established comprising the Muslim League, Indian National Congress, and the British. However, after nearly 2 centuries of stoking ethnic tensions, it became impossible for the Muslim League and Indian Congress to come to any clear agreements on the future of their nations. Each side was under enormous pressure from the Hindus or Muslims to not hand over too much power to the other group. As negotiations continued, so too did the rioting, and thousands died as British soldiers and police stood by and did nothing. To them, it seemed civil war was even closer than they were expecting, and they did not want to have to deal with this at all. And so the British simply set a deadline for independence: June 1948. The Congress and Muslim League were now forced to hammer out an agreement in time, so they came up with a compromise. India and Pakistan would become 2 independent countries. However, after independence, they would continue their discussions to one day unite under a new united government. And if you look at a map of South Asia today, you will see that nothing ever came from this. However, this left the next question: what was to become Pakistan and what was to become India? The Muslim League proposed that provinces with a Muslim majority would become Pakistan. But there was a problem with this approach. Hindus and Muslims had been living side by side for generations, and this would leave large Hindu populations in Pakistan and large Muslim populations in India. This would eventually result in 14 to 18 million people moving from one country to the other before independence, and around 1 million of them would die in the process. Then there were also the regions of Punjab and Bengal. Both of them had a large Muslim and Hindu population, with no clear majority for either of them. And so those regions were partitioned as well, along religious lines, with one part becoming Indian and the other Pakistani. As a result, people who lived alongside each other for centuries and their economies were split apart by a border, causing long-term economic harm. However, if you look at this map of where each religious group lived, you will notice that Muslims were the majority on either side of the country. They would become East Pakistan and West Pakistan, meaning Pakistan would be split in the middle by India. They would need a way to govern both regions at the same time. At first, the Muslim League proposed a free trade union between Pakistan and India, thereby allowing goods to flow freely between East and West Pakistan. However, this was considered infeasible by India. Next, they suggested a corridor running through India. However, India did not want to split their country in half with a Pakistani corridor, nor did they want to guard such a large border while having such a small economy. And so in the end, they decided to remain separate, eventually resulting in a civil war between Pakistan and Bangladesh. We won't go into detail about it here, so it's not the main focus of the video. However, with the support of India, Bangladesh was able to defeat Pakistan and gain its independence in 1971. And there was one final issue. The British did not control all of British India directly. There were also the 565 princely states, each ruled by a prince, and it was unclear what to do with them. So the British came up with a brilliant idea that horrified everyone. make every single one of them an independent country, turning the entire Indian subcontinent into a gigantic web of tiny states, each influenced by the British, Chinese, Soviets or other countries. It would be chaos. It would be utter chaos. In a panic, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League sat down with the princes to prevent this chaos. And luckily for them, most of the princes shared the exact same concerns, and almost every single one of them decided to join either India or Pakistan upon independence. This was a massive relief. However, there were 4 princely states that wanted to become independent: Hyderabad, Kashmir, Bhopal and Travancore. They were some of the largest states in British India, so Pakistan and India put pressure on them to pick sides. They looked to the British for help, but the British just wanted to get out of this whole situation and didn't have the resources to provide any meaningful support. After all, they were still recovering from World War II and trying to hold on to the other parts of their empire as well. And so these 4 princely states were eventually strong-armed into joining either India or Pakistan. And over time, the princes of all those princely states would retire as the Indian government took over governance. Most of them retired into obscurity, though several of them ran for elections and won. By 1947, violence had increased to such a degree between Hindus and Muslims that there were food shortages, mass killings, and the burning of thousands of homes. The native leadership wanted to handle the matter on their own, believing that even if the British had the best intentions, that they themselves would be better able to handle the situation than the British ever could. The people of British India just wanted the British to leave. And so, with the British wanting to leave, and with the plan for partition in hand, the Muslim League, Indian Congress and British government moved the date for independence forward to August 15th, 1947. In the end, nobody was satisfied with this arrangement, but it was the one they finally agreed on. Hoping to avoid an all-out religious civil war, both Pakistan and India would become secular states where people of all religions could live freely, with Jinnah declaring that you may belong to any religion or caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state. However, if India and Pakistan became independent, it would mean trade between the British Empire and these newly independent countries would be reduced. So, the last order of business was to establish a new type of diplomatic relationship between India, Pakistan and the British Empire. And for this, they created something called the Commonwealth of Nations. In very simple terms, this is a group of countries who used to be part of the British Empire. Today it includes 56 nations, and it functions as a sort of UN for its member states. These members often participate in trade agreements and other forms of international cooperation, but with little or no obligations to actually join them. At first, this organization was just there to facilitate cooperation between the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia and South Africa. These countries were semi-independent from the UK at the time, but with India and Pakistan, it would now include independent former colonies as well. With this new organization, the people of British India would see the British off as friends, while maintaining many of their trade and diplomatic relations. However, they would not accept the British king as their own king, like with Australia or Canada. And so, on Friday, August 15th, 1947, the British flag was lowered and the new flags of India and Pakistan were hoisted. Not all parts of modern-day India and Pakistan joined at the time of independence, however. Junagadh and Hyderabad were annexed by India in 1948. Calicut by Pakistan in 1948 as well. Gwadar was annexed by Pakistan in 1958, and Sikkim merged with India in 1975. Kashmir, however, became a disputed territory between India, Pakistan and China and remains divided to this day. But wait, the video isn't over. There are still 2 small issues India had to deal with. Chapter 8: France and Portugal. Remember in the beginning when I said the British, Portuguese and French had colonies in India? Well, so far we've just been talking about the British colonies. So what's going on with the French and Portuguese colonies? Well, they were largely unaffected by the independence movement. In the case of France, they negotiated a deal with India to just hand over their tiny colonies to India. However, Indian independence was just the beginning of the collapse of European empires. After India, most of Asia and Africa declared independence as well. We made a video about those topics as well if you're interested. But as more European empires lost their colonies, the Portuguese dictator wanted to hold on to the Portuguese ones as much as possible, wanting to be the last European colonial empire. Firstly, India used diplomacy to get these colonies under their control, but the Portuguese dictator simply refused. So India began supporting pro-Indian resistance forces, and in 1954, after more than 2 weeks of fighting, they took control over Dadra and Nagar Haveli. Now, only Portugal's largest Indian colony was left, Goa. This would need a proper invasion, not a pro-Indian resistance movement. So on December 17, 1961, India simply invaded. The Portuguese forces were outnumbered 13-1. Portugal had 4 ships, while India had 16 ships, 44 aircraft, numerous tanks and armored vehicles. Everybody in the Portuguese government knew that they would lose a war against India, but the dictator ordered the Portuguese general to fight to the last man. The Portuguese general, however, surrendered after just 2 days of fighting, over 50 people dead on both sides, and being completely surrounded. And so on December 19, 1961, Goa was annexed by India. Portugal and India would remain rivals until the end of Portugal's dictatorship in 1974. Absolutely nobody in Portugal saw the point of being at war with India, and just 8 months later, the two countries signed a peace treaty at the end of that year. Now, before we continue, we need to talk about this map. I got an email from the Indian government that they will block all my videos unless I use a specific map of India, which includes territory that is occupied by other countries. But if I start putting every claim onto every single map, we're going to have a lot of overlapping regions. So to make sure nobody can get angry at me for using the wrong borders, I'm just going to cover it up with my face. After all, there is no Avery in bravery. Chapter 9. Independence. This new and independent India faced many problems. The first was to keep the country together. India had been unified 5 times earlier, and each time it fell apart again. And to many, this process appeared to already be happening again in 1947. The British Indian colony had been split up into various countries: Pakistan, Sikkim, Sri Lanka, and India itself. It was not unreasonable to assume that more regions would split off to form their own country at some point in the future, such as what happened in Pakistan in 1971 when Bangladesh declared independence. About half of India was ruled through princely states, and those princes still controlled large parts of their former states instead of having the central government control the entire country. And now that the British army was leaving India, there was little to keep those princes in line with the newly independent India. In essence, India was confronted with the problem that they had a country without a functional government. And so the Indian state needed a reason for them to stay in power. And that reason they decided to go with was money. India was going to invest in infrastructure across the country, connecting the various regions together so that it was easier to trade. The rich and powerful earned money through owning businesses or taxing businesses. And if those companies were able to sell to more Indians, that meant more money for the rich and powerful because they owned the businesses. And so the Indian elites would want to stay with India to increase their own personal wealth. This is a process which India is still undergoing today, with large parts of the Indian economic growth coming from increased trade within India, and much of that trade is in the hands of a small elite class. Another issue to nation building is that India is a very diverse country. There are 122 languages spoken by at least 1 million people. There are various cultures spread out across the nation, and customs ranging wildly between regions. And by investing in infrastructure, these people would become more connected. They will move to other parts of the country, meet new people, and learn about their own nation. After several generations, the people will no longer think of themselves as belonging to a particular region, but to a single nation. This is a process a lot of countries have gone through. France, Germany, and Italy began this process in the 19th century, and they still face the problem of regionalism, such as Bavaria, where a third of the population supports independence from Germany. But India started this process only 80 years ago, and so for the first few decades since independence, they had to spend a significant amount of money to create an India where people would feel like Indians. And this infrastructure was desperately needed, because India, upon independence in 1947, faced shortages of almost everything, and particularly food. By the late 1940s, about 150 million Indians had to receive food directly from the government, with each person receiving 1,200 calories per day, which was just enough to survive. But why did India face such massive shortages? Remember that the British did not invest in improving agriculture in India unless it was for valuable crops such as sugarcane or indigo. So India, one of the most fertile countries in the world, was facing a food shortage because of poor infrastructure. In essence, India was still stuck in the 18th and 19th century because it didn't innovate under colonial rule. As a result, industry in India was severely lacking. And then, when they were dragged into World War II by the British, India wasn't allowed to build new factories unless those factories supported the war effort. And so, for 6 years, India didn't produce more products. But at the same time, India gained 42 million new people. These people needed products. But with no factories being set up to sell these products, India faced a massive shortage. In addition, bad weather in the 1940s caused many harvests to fail, resulting in a starving population. With a severe lack of even the most basic of products, how could India solve their problems? Well, the solution seemed simple. If you have a shortage of goods, you need to produce more goods, and the best way to produce more goods is to invest in machines. And so India decided to go on a campaign of industrialization. But how were they going to manage industrialization for 360 million people? The system they chose was a combination of capitalism and a command economy, often referred to as Soviet-style communism. A command economy is a system where the government takes control over most aspects of the economy, and then they plan nearly all aspects, from supply lines to where factories should be built to what products should be produced. Today, we know that command economies don't work for long-term development. So why did India decide to use this system? Well, for that we need to look at the options available to India at the time. Back then, there were only 3 systems that had succeeded in bringing wealth to a nation. The first system was the European model, whereby a country would colonize other parts of the world and use the wealth extracted from these colonies to invest in industries in their own countries. But India was not interested in world conquest right after having gained independence themselves from this same system. Then there was the US model. With this model, a country would go to war with other countries to force them to open their markets to you. This allows you to gain a lot of foreign customers every time you win a war, but India didn't have a military power to do so, and there was no country with enough customers, so 360 million Indians had to work in factories. So this model couldn't be implemented either. And then the last model was the Soviet model, which managed to industrialize the nation in just a few decades. In just the first 10 years, the Soviet Union produced 4 times more iron and steel, 2.5 times more oil, 7 times more electricity, and 250 times more cars. And while India was aware of a lot of the criticisms, such as lower quality of goods and the high death toll of people working to industrialize the nation, India's leadership believed it could industrialize without committing atrocities, while keeping the quality of products relatively good. They were able to point towards Latin American countries during the Great Depression in the 1930s as an example of economic growth through government control, where many Latin American countries had industrialized during the Depression as a way to end the economic crisis in their own country. So, from the perspective of the Indian leadership in 1947, this type of economic management seemed far more effective than capitalism or imperialism. And they argued that the poverty of India was because a capitalist Britain squandered India's resources. So if instead the government was in charge of economic management, they would be able to make sure that the wealth of the nation would be shared with the poorest people of the nation and not just the rich. And so, presented with these three options, India chose to adopt the Soviet model. But it couldn't go as far with the Soviet models as the leaders wanted. This is because the Indian elites who owned industries or ruled over the former princely states wanted to keep their power. If the central government takes over factories, then the elites lose power. This is a common struggle throughout modern India's history. The country is so large and has so many different people living within its border that any decision taken by any of the governments immediately comes into conflict with one of these groups of people. And so India's democracy is filled with lobbyists and infighting who fight over everything. And as a result, the compromises often make no sense. In this case, where they had to decide how the economy should be managed, they made a compromise where India would have a system that incorporated aspects from both socialism and capitalism. Such a system can be very effective. Today, the countries with the healthiest, happiest, and best educated people use parts of socialism and capitalism called social democracy. India, however, decided to take the worst parts of capitalism and the worst parts of communism. Because the state would take direct ownership of the military industry, atomic energy, and railways. Existing businesses were allowed. However, the government was the only one allowed to set up new businesses in vital sectors, such as coal mining, iron and steel production, aircraft manufacturing, shipbuilding, telecommunications, and the mining industry. Over time, businesses in this industry would be taken over by the government, and this was one of the worst decisions they could have taken. Because a bunch of government officials are simply incapable of managing an economy effectively in a country the size of India. Humans simply are not intelligent enough to centrally plan an entire economy. In comparison, under a healthy capitalist system, thousands of businesses have to compete with each other. When a business lags behind the other businesses, it won't make a profit and it will go bankrupt. This system assures that the most efficient businesses will remain in business, thus creating an incentive for companies to create better products at a lower price. But when a single government manages thousands of businesses, there is no process by which inefficient businesses are replaced with more efficient ones. And so, the companies run by the governments are usually far less efficient than businesses run by people. And the type of businesses that were supposed to be managed by the government were also the most important businesses in an economy. For example, the iron and steel industries are of vital importance to growing the economy. New machines need steel. Factories are often made from steel. Vehicles use a steel frame. And steel is just as important to regular people. If you look around you, almost everything you see requires steel. Support for the building you live in, the case of your computer, and the ship, train or vehicle bringing the products to the store. So to grow your economy, you need access to steel. But because the government took control over these vital industries, it was making sure that the industries needed the most for economic growth were also managed the least efficiently. To give an example of such inefficiency, the Bokaro steel mill is one of the largest steel producers in India. It was built with the help of the Soviets. However, the Soviet designs couldn't be used in Indian manufacturing, the machines often broke down, and the quality of the products it did produce was incredibly low. And the capitalist parts of the Indian economy were flawed as well. As mentioned earlier, a healthy capitalist system requires competition, so businesses who don't innovate will go bankrupt. In India, however, businesses were often protected from competition. If you wanted to set up a new business in India, you needed to get a license. Receiving such a license would often take years. In those years, other businesses will have looked at your license application and prepared for your arrival. By the time that your facility is finally ready to start producing new products, your competitors will have already made those same products and cornered the market. Meaning that if you invest in India, you would likely not earn a profit. So the capitalist system was unhealthy, without competition, and the rich and powerful were able to stay in power without needing to improve their operations. So in summary, the Indian economy lacked competition, which in turn meant that it was less innovative. It kept out foreign investors and knowledge, which in turn meant that it didn't have as much access to more advanced machinery and equipment of the developed world. And the basic products needed to create all of these new factories, machines and equipment were managed in an inefficient way. As a result, India took some of the worst aspects of both systems. But as a wise man once said, you should never half-ass two things. Instead, whole-ass one thing. And as a result, India's economy in the 1940s and 50s grew slowly. So slowly, in fact, that India decided to ask for foreign aid. And because India used aspects of both the Soviet economy and the Western economy, it maintained good relations with both sides during the Cold War. India used this to their advantage by taking money from both sides. By the 1950s, foreign aid had become the largest source of investment in India. And yet, the economy still grew very slowly. So slowly that the leaders realized that they were doing a poor job. And they concluded that the reason India's economy wasn't growing fast enough was because the government didn't have enough control over the economy. And as a result, more businesses were taken over by the central government, while private businesses were allowed in fewer and fewer industries. So through the late 1950s and early 60s, the Indian government became more involved in economic management of the country. But of course, using a failing system more doesn't change the fact that it is a failing system. And the more the government took control, the less efficient the economy was run, and the more foreign aid the government had to ask for. Chapter 10. The Rise of Capitalism. By the 1960s, India's economy had become insignificant in world affairs. For example, in 1955, India produced 46% of all exported peanut oil in the world. By 1960, this was only 1%. The world no longer wanted to put Indian nuts in their mouths. India's failure to modernize its economy meant that other countries could start selling the same products for a lower price. And India was caught in a cycle. The more it took control over the economy, the less efficient it became, and the more customers they started losing abroad. As a result, the government would earn less in taxes and would have to rely more on foreign aid. And the more India had to take over the economy to use that foreign aid, thereby becoming less efficient, losing more customers, etc. And so, India was doomed from the start, with a culture which did not put an emphasis on innovation, the British military departure, meaning India's regions could be split apart, a government which controlled the fundamental aspects of economic growth, and a capitalism that did not allow for healthy competition. So now, it was clear that the economic system India used was a broken system that could not work. Gaining independence from the British only resulted in becoming dependent on the Soviet Union and the United States to keep the economy afloat. And by now, there were other countries that were far more successful. Western Europe and Japan had quickly recovered after World War II, while South Korea, Taiwan and Singapore were rapidly growing their economy. The people in these parts of the world were becoming rich at a much faster speed than India was, and they were capitalist nations. So clearly, government control of the economy was not an effective way to bring prosperity to the nation. And seeing this broken system, the USA saw an opportunity to promote capitalism in India. They threatened to reduce the amount of foreign aid they would send to India unless India opened up its markets to US companies. India needed that foreign aid to buy food every time a bad monsoon damaged their crops. But this time, however, the USA wanted to sell agricultural tools to India. The USA had one of the best agricultural industries in the world, and it could export its knowledge, technology and machines to India with their hundreds of millions of farmers, each of which was a potential customer. And if those farmers became richer, they would be able to purchase even more US products and thereby making the USA even more money. And so India had a simple choice. They could either starve or they could abandon a failing system in favor of more capitalism. And India chose to become slightly more capitalist. They stopped centrally planning the economy, they sold government-owned businesses, the system of licenses was simplified, farmers were given grants to invest in more efficient farms, new infrastructure was built, and India allowed foreign companies to set up new businesses with Indian companies, whereby the Indian and foreign company each owns a new business, which is called a joint venture. This strategy was successful. It brought valuable knowledge and skills to India, and new factories were built across the country to produce luxury goods such as radios, fridges, processed food, and more. And for the first time since independence, India, a country with some of the most fertile farmland in the world by the way, was finally able to feed its own people reliably. And so this strategy was clearly a success, and the Indian government wanted more of this success. But the government still controlled important industries. So, in order to promote economic growth, the leaders decided to sell these vital products, such as steel and electricity, at a very low price. The government wouldn't earn any money from it, but people could set up new businesses at a much lower cost. And so, new companies were created all over India. And by the late 1960s, about 80% of India's economy was privately owned, and the economy was growing by 7% each year. At that time, this kind of growth for a large country like India was unheard of. But even in the 1960s, India still struggled to provide enough food and enough products for everyone in the country. But at least now, India was finally moving in the right direction and might become a developed country within the next 100 years or so. With economic growth finally achieved, India's next goal was to become as self-sufficient as possible. This means that India would try to produce every type of product that Indians wanted to buy. The reason for such a policy was the belief that if a country could produce what they needed themselves, then other countries could never take advantage of India ever again. To give a recent example, the UK does not produce enough food for its own people. So the UK imports food from other countries, particularly countries from the European Union. When the UK decided to leave the Union, it faced the problem that the country might not be able to get enough food. Thus, the EU had significant leverage over the UK. India was afraid of something similar happening to them, and that India would once again become a colony of a foreign nation if those nations had too much influence over India. And so India was going to try to produce as much as possible themselves, so they could become a strong independent country who needs no trade partner. But the problem with this approach is that certain countries are naturally good and bad at certain things. For example, Japan has a lot of mountains, which makes it impossible for them to grow enough food. They will therefore never have a strong agriculture. But it does have a lot of coastlines, which means that wherever you build a factory, you will have a port nearby. As a result, Japan is naturally good at transporting heavy products such as cars or electronics across the world, because no matter where in Japan you are, the coast is always nearby, and transporting goods with cargo ships is cheap. So instead, Japan uses a process called comparative advantage. This is a system in which a country focuses on things they are good at, then sell those products for a large profit, and buy things they can't produce themselves. So Japan sells stuff that they are good at, such as cars, adult tentacle entertainment, and integrated circuits, while in turn buying fuel, machinery, and food. And as a result, Japan is far richer for focusing on certain goods than they would be trying to create everything they needed themselves. And so, the decision of India to try to build everything themselves meant that the country wasn't focusing on certain things they are good at. As a result, it was usually cheaper to buy products from other countries because those countries had focused on just a few industries and could sell the same products at a lower price than India ever could. And in the end, almost nobody wanted to buy Indian goods by the 60s and 70s, except inside India itself. This is because India simply made it illegal for anyone to import goods that could theoretically be made in India, regardless of whether they could produce enough for everyone. So if, for example, you own a factory and you need to buy parts from abroad, you either have to pay a very high tax on those products, or you have to try making them yourself. As a result, India's industry remained very inefficient, even though the economy was finally starting to grow. To show this mismanagement in concrete terms, instead of abstract examples, let's look at India's agriculture. So what could India have done to see the same levels of economic growth as Taiwan, China or Ireland? Well, there are some things India is better at than most countries. As stated before, India has many rivers, frequent rains and tropical climates. This makes it a perfect location for growing certain types of crops such as rice or spices. In fact, India has the most farmland of any country in the world. India could therefore have focused on growing their agricultural sector for luxury products, and then sell them for a higher profit in colder and richer countries, such as the West, the Soviet bloc or Japan. However, India's farmers couldn't earn a profit because the elites of the country were in control of the wholesalers. These wholesalers were often the only ones willing to buy someone's harvest, and there was usually only one wholesaler to which a farmer was able to sell their produce. This meant that the farmer had to accept whatever price that one wholesale company was willing to give them, or they wouldn't be able to sell anything at all. What India could have done was break up the wholesalers so they would be forced to compete against each other. As a result, farmers would have a choice of which wholesalers to sell their crops to, and they would have to offer higher prices for this produce. This in turn means that farmers would earn more profit if they produced more food. As a result, they would invest in better equipment, machines and fertilizer to increase their output, because that would have meant more money for them and their families. The government could then have helped the farmers by investing in factories making fertilizer, possibly with the help of foreign experts who had experience in industrialized agriculture such as Europe and North America. It could have set up universities and vocational schools where people could learn about better and more efficient agricultural techniques, eventually creating research facilities where Indian scientists would develop better tools and better seeds, such as plants that are immune to drought or flooding, or able to produce more food per square meter. Eventually, India could have become the largest producer of food in the world, exporting a variety of tropical fruits, flowers, spices and rice across the globe. The profits from agriculture would have allowed India to invest in other industries, so the country would have a diverse economy focusing on multiple different products, the same way other developed countries have done, focusing on a couple of industries to use those profits to buy the things they could not produce themselves. Instead, countries like the Philippines and Mexico were the ones focusing on better seeds for tropical climates. And by the 1960s, India was buying seeds from those countries because it failed to create its own research facilities. And even to this day, Indian farmers are often buying seeds from foreign companies, despite India being one of the most suitable locations to research tropical agriculture because it has so much farmland, so many farmers, and such frequent harsh weather conditions. This is just one of the many failed opportunities India's leaders squandered with ineffective policies. And when a country squanders opportunities, there will always be foreign countries willing to exploit you. However, by the 1970s, India at least no longer had to worry about feeding its own people. But the elites did not like this new system. They were afraid that foreign businesses could produce products cheaper and thereby cutting into the profits of the Indian elites. And so those elites put in place during British colonization kept being a problem even to an independent India. As a result, the government kept control over various parts of the economy because the elites could use this control for their own benefit. As a result, India's more open economy was still limited. India's economy still lacked a healthy competition between businesses. Its infrastructure, while improving, was still poor, and the government did not provide a good safety net on which people who failed in this system could try again. All of these would be effective measures to grow your economy, but were blocked by many of the elites who feared it would cut into their own personal profits. And to this day, some of the most powerful people in India use their influence to block reasonable economic policies in order to enrich themselves. And the opening up of India is still taking place to this day. So while countries like China or South Korea opened to the outside world in just a few years, India has spent the last 70 years slowly opening up. And to this day, India is still a relatively closed-off country to the outside world, and many investors choose to do business in another, more open economy instead. And in fact, most of the times, India's reforms are forced upon it. From famines to foreign aid, it's usually the outside world demanding that India opens its country for freer and open business because India has hundreds of millions of potential customers. And in the 1980s, another change forced India to reform again: the breakup of the Soviet Union. You see, India tried to remain friends with both Western countries and Soviet countries. But by the 1980s, the Soviet economies were far weaker than the Western economies. Eventually, the Soviet Union had so many issues, it decided to focus on its own internal problems. And for India, this was a major problem, because the Soviet Union decided to stop sending so much money to India and instead keep it for their own people. The USA saw this and decided to do the same. And the Indian government now faced the problem that they wouldn't have enough money anymore. Then, a few years later, the Soviet Union collapsed entirely. This collapse was a disaster for the economies of the former Soviet countries, as its people became significantly poorer. And because the people were poorer, they couldn't buy as many Indian products anymore. Indian businesses suffered from the collapse of the Soviet Union. India had a simple solution. If we lose customers in former Soviet countries, we will simply do more business with Western countries. After all, the economies of the West were far larger than the economy of the Soviet Union, and so India was forced to shift more towards the West. At the same time, China also pivoted towards the West. And just as the Soviet Union and India had done, China also abandoned the disastrous policy of a command economy in favor of more capitalism. China opened up quickly to the outside world and focused their economy on manufactured goods, with factories opening all across China. India saw billions of dollars being invested into China, and they wanted the same thing. But India had a big problem. Industry accounted for only 27% of the Indian economy, while it accounted for 45% in China's economy. That meant that China had far better facilities for factories than India had. Plus, India's industry was controlled by the elites and thus protected from foreign competition. And so, India decided to focus on services instead, such as customer service, administration, and IT. India has a large population of English speakers, while many of the richest countries in the world also speak English. And so it began selling cheap services to countries like the USA, Canada, New Zealand, etc. However, its industry would remain on selling to just India. However, this caused another problem in the 1990s, and India was once again forced to open its markets even further because it was being sued at the court of the World Trade Organization. And this court ruled that India created unfair competition by protecting its own businesses with high tariffs. So if you want to buy a product from abroad costing 100 rupees, there was usually a tax on it of up to 400%. This meant that the 100 rupee product now became 500 rupees. But this tax only applied to foreign products, so most Indians decided to simply buy Indian products. And while they were more expensive than the 100 rupees, they were less expensive than the 500 rupees. And the court decided that this practice was illegal and India had to reduce its tariffs on a large range of products. And this was very advantageous for Indian businesses, because most of them needed parts from other countries to produce their own products. And as foreign parts became cheaper, Indian products became cheaper. And as Indian products became cheaper, more people started to buy them. As a result, Indians became richer because India was once again forced to make good economic policy. And so the modern Indian economy had its foundations in the 1980s and 90s, an economy focusing on exporting food and services while selling manufactured goods to their own population, while globalization would not be an Indian priority. As a result, India's growth is smaller than that of those countries who have embraced globalization, such as Vietnam or China. However, it also doesn't suffer as much during worldwide economic crises, causing India to have a smaller but steady growth while suffering only 4 recessions in its entire history. Today's India is a relatively stable country. While it doesn't see the enormous economic growth rates of China, it's still growing at a steady pace at around 6% per year, and its people are becoming richer at a steady rate. The government has managed various aspects quite well in the recent decades. It doesn't have a lot of debt, it doesn't spend too much, and it has large reserves of money should a crisis ever occur in India. India keeps opening up slowly to the outside world, and investments in the Indian economy are slowly growing. But it also faces many problems it needs to solve if it wants to keep up this growth. Its education system does not properly educate, with only 55% of 10-year-olds able to read and understand a simple story. Many people do not receive a healthy meal on a daily basis, with nearly half of all childhood deaths caused by a poor diet. Its financial systems, such as banks, are in a poor state, but banks are also some of the greatest investors in the economy, so unhealthy banks means fewer investments. Foreign companies still find it very difficult to do business in India and prefer doing business in Bangladesh or Vietnam. And the Indian healthcare system is unable to take care of all its people. And as more and more developing countries are implementing healthy economic policies in the 21st century, it means that more countries across the world will develop its own industries. This will cause more competition, and whether India will be able to compete with countries that are far better managed remains very uncertain. India will likely not become a superpower within the next decade. Yet, most of us will probably live to see a day where India will become a dominant power in the world. It is expected that by 2050, India will overtake the USA in economic power, becoming the second largest economy in the world right behind China. And as long as the Indian government does not make major mistakes like it has done in the past, this outlook seems very likely, and we can expect a world where India becomes a superpower.